Smart implants.
Hi and welcome to another panel for MedTech. This time we're going to be focusing on smart implants. With me I have Professor Pierre Schembri-Wismayer and Dalli. Thank you for coming on the show, guys.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. So before we get into it, tell us a bit about yourselves, a bit of a bio.
Okay, so I'm a medical doctor. I teach anatomy at the University of Malta, and my original interest was in cancer research. It still is, but I also do work on biomechanics, where I collaborate with the engineers, including my colleague here, Donald, and on stem cells and other things as well.
Mm-hmm. Donald?
Hi, I am Donald Dalli. I am the main PhD student behind this project. I am a mechanical engineer. I have in the past mainly focused on designing robotic systems, but then I met Pierre Schembri-Wismayer. He came up with this idea. And so I was very keen to develop this project into designing this new hip implant.
Mm-hmm. And that's really what we want to talk about today. Professor Schembri-Wismayer, tell us a bit about this hip replacement that you've been working on.
Okay, so first of all, we should point out that hip replacements are actually a very common problem. If you can see on this image over here, we have the amount of hip replacements happening in Europe per 100,000 of the population, and you can see in some countries like Germany you have around 300 hip replacements per 100,000 of the population. Malta would be around here with around 70, okay, which is funny considering that we have a rather large population also with low levels of exercise, and this can be discussed in a number of situations, but it's not to discuss here. Because of this situation with hip joint replacements, there is the need for, you can see also on this map here where we have Malta with 76 per 100,000 of the population. Mm-hmm. Because of this need for hip joint replacements, we are living longer now, and therefore a hip joint replacement normally lasts about 10 to 20 years. Now, if you have a hip replacement at 50 or at 60, 10 to 20 years, you might only be 70 years old. And you might need another hip replacement. Your hip replacement might be not good enough, and you might live till 85, for example, the average age of life in Malta. So it is very important that hip joints last for a very long time. And we decided to try and derive a hip joint which would actually be better than the ones which are already out there. The reason why we actually need a hip replacement is, again, if you look at this image over here, we have what happens in arthritis, which is because of the weight on the hip joint, the cartilage, the red stuff you can see over there in that image, degrades, and because it degrades, bone starts to rub against bone. There's no cushioning, there's no buffering, and as the bone rubs against bone, we get the severe pain which is characteristic of arthritis. And although this can be temporarily controlled for a little bit with drugs, eventually the pain is so hard and the defective walking is so severe that one needs to actually replace the joint. So we decided to work on the basis of this basic principle, that, as you can see on this image, hip joints suffer from quite a high level of arthritis, whilst ankle joints, on the other hand, which are lower down in the body and therefore should be carrying more weight, actually don't suffer from so much arthritis. So we said, why is this? And if you look at the shape of the joint, one of them is a ball and socket joint, so you have a ball working into a socket, whereas the other one is a hinge where you have movement only in one direction, whilst in a ball and socket you have movement in all kinds of different directions. Now, if you have that, because it's a ball, you have a lot of pressure on one point, and over time, if you get wearing, as the joint gets worn out, as you can see here, the weight is distributed nicely over the whole thing, but as it wears out and you don't have a perfect fit anymore, and this happens both in the natural hip joint and also in a prosthesis, in an artificial replacement, eventually you get a lot of pressure on one point, and that pressure on one point results in the hip joint becoming less and less effective and eventually needing to be replaced. So we decided to work on this and try and replace. In fact, here I've shown you a number of x-rays as well, so you can see this in reality. You have the curved curvature of the hip joint, if you look at this image, the curved surface of the hip joint over there, as opposed to the relatively flat surface of the ankle joint. And therefore, because there's a flat surface, which allows the distribution of the weight over a much wider area, we get less pressure and possibly less degradation. And this might explain why the ankle joint suffers less arthritis. So the whole point of this project was to try and make the hip joint into a number of ankle joints. That's the easiest way to try and explain it. In terms of more engineering detail, I think Donald will be the person who can explain it most, but I can show a few images as well as needs be.
Yeah, so as the professor noted, Donald, you could probably tell us a bit more about the mechanical aspects of this innovation. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so essentially, as Pierre said, Pierre noticed that the stress distribution on the ankle is much lower than that on the hip joint. And so for this reason, instead of having a spherical joint, we used these cylinders and we integrated them together at 90 degrees. So in total, we have 3 cylindrical joints, which are at 90 degrees. The main reason of incorporating three cylinders is to replicate the 3 degrees of motion of the hip. Because with the hip, you can perform 3 types of motion, forward and backwards, sideways, and you have internal and external rotation. With a cylindrical joint, you can only perform only one type of motion along one plane. So for this reason, we have these 3 cylinders stacked at 90 degrees to each other. And this enabled us in order to reproduce the same motion whilst achieving the same functionality. As we have observed on the market, there is nothing like this type of design since their introduction on the market. Hip implants have always followed the ball and socket design. Now, another main advantage of using cylindrical joint is that the polyethylene, which is the main type of polymer which is used in hip implants, becomes stronger when it's subjected to linear motion. This is in fact a disadvantage with current ball and socket designs. So when you have the ball and socket is going in 3 directions. So it's going in different directions. And as a consequence, this will cause the surface structure to become convoluted and essentially will become weaker. And by time, this will result in increased wear. By introducing this cylindrical joint, all the motion is linear, and this would cause all the motion to make the structure even stronger. And in fact, when we tested the implant, we have observed that the structure resulted in lower wear.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned testing there. Quality control with these kind of devices is essential. How do you go about doing that?
So basically, during my doctoral studies, first I designed a test rig. So basically, we got a hip implant designed with our novel system consisting of the 3 cylindrical joints. And we try to simulate 3 aspects. We have the motion, the load, and the environment. So basically, we consider the walking gait cycle. And during the walking gait cycle, the loads on the hip implant can increase up to 3,000 newtons. The main reason being at one instant, all the loads are being supported on one leg, and this would cause an increase in the amount of loads being exposed on the joints. And this is one of the main reasons why osteoarthritis is one of the leading causes for degenerative diseases in hip joints. So first we built this test rig. We tested it at the University of Malta. Then we have observed that we have satisfactory results. Of course, this test rig was only a prototype. So for this reason, after we observed that we had satisfactory results, we machined a total of 8 implants. We sent them to Germany. This is an accredited testing lab facility for 4 implants. And they've been tested to simulate 5 years worth of use. And when we compared our implants to those which were tested under the same conditions, same materials, exactly everything the same except for design, we observed that actually our design produced much lower wear than that produced by the conventional ball and socket implants. And this is mainly attributed to the cylindrical design, which allows motion in one direction and the increased contact area, resulting in lower contact stress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and back to you, Pierre. Obviously, yes. At the end of the day, there has to be some kind of procedure to get this implanted.
Yes.
Have you approached orthopedic surgeons or anyone in the medical sector?
This is a very important point, Jeremy. So obviously, yes, with the first of all, in actually planning the design, we actually had 2 orthopedic surgeons regularly collaborating with us, and we showed them the prototypes and improved the prototypes based on their feedback. And this was also very helpful. One of the things which is particular, which we could do locally, and if anyone is squeamish, they should look away a bit. But if you see the image I'm showing now on the screen, we actually did a mock operation using the 2 orthopedic surgeons and an orthopedic nurse from Mater Dei Hospital actually did a mock operation on a cadaver in the anatomy lab. I teach anatomy, and we have cadavers which we normally use to teach medical students how to become doctors. But the cadavers are nowadays prepared in such a way that they remain soft and they mimic a live human being. And therefore, the surgeons could actually implant the hip which we had introduced, which we had produced, the prototype, into a cadaver, and they were impressed by how easy it was, because we made sure it would fit with existing joints and things of the sort, existing tooling, and things of the sort. And apart from that, they were impressed that there was very good mobility. In fact, one of the comments was that the patient after the operation could theoretically do yoga inside the operating theater. In other words, there was extremely good mobility, and again, maybe Donald will have more chance to extend on this, because this again opens up a potential niche market for our replacement, for our prosthesis.
Mm-hmm. Yes, essentially, when we introduced the cylindrical design, this has enabled us to explore other design solutions. And in fact, one of the main problems with ball and socket implants is that they are susceptible to dislocation, meaning that the ball can escape out of the socket. Since we have cylindrical design, we came up with a further novel feature which enables the components to interlock to each other. And in fact, as a result of this interlocking mechanism, one can extend the hip, can flex the hip joint without dislocating. And as a consequence, this resulted in a very stable joint. This is a very attractive feature, especially with young patients who are still into sports and exercise. So we think we will, as Pierre said, we can go into this niche market.
Mm-hmm. Now, as some of our more observant viewers may have seen, both of you actually come from separate departments at the university. We have Pierre, who's focused on the medical aspect, and then we have Donald, who's more in the engineering department. Now, how did you guys come about working together? What can you say about this collaboration you've had between you?
Okay, so I will start off. It's interesting that Donald's engineering supervisor, so I was one of his supervisors for his doctorate. His other supervisor is an engineer, Professor Joseph Bohajar. And we met many years ago, actually, in a similar environment to this one, when I was filming another TV series with European Union funding to encourage kids to get into science. And I was looking at various people from Malta who were studying postgraduate science of different aspects, medicine, engineering, physics, etc., abroad. And I interviewed Prof. Bohajar, and since then we've become firm friends. And one of the big advantages of working in a small university like Malta is that we are 100 meters away from each other. The different faculties are right next to each other. So basically, it's very easy for me to cross over and discuss an idea and show prototypes and to actually put things together in a face-to-face format, not just over emails and video links and things of the sort. And because of this, when I came up with this idea, I immediately discussed it with Joe. He immediately saw the benefits in it, and together we opted for applying for MCST funding, Malta Council of Science and Technology funding, and we achieved this, and through this we could employ Donald, who has done a sterling job in actually not only taking an idea all the way from design to prototyping, but also building a local jig, a first-time local jig in Malta to test it, and then getting it to a point where we actually are already at a competitive place in the market.
Mm-hmm. And obviously at the end of the day, this has to, if all the testing goes well and you're successful, this has to be produced somehow, and it has to be commercialized.
Yes.
At what point is this at?
Okay, so as Donald mentioned, we have already had the implants tested, and a lot of the testing which is required already for something like FDA approval has already been done. Mm-hmm. However, there may be some particular special tests which still need to be done, and obviously our budget is run out at this point. However, we have patented the device worldwide, and for any combination of materials, actually, not only for the metal and polymer which we worked with in this prototype. And therefore, at this point, it is a case of trying to find partner industry who obviously have the experience of taking a prototype all the way through the final development stages to eventually come to registration and market authorization and then marketing. And we are in communication with a number of these potential clients, potential buyers who would be interested in the hip and would take it forward. Obviously, I'm not at this point in liberty to mention who they are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have the last few minutes left. Before we close off the panel, is there anything either of you would like to add?
Okay, so if you can look at the images now, one of the things to be aware of is that the rise of this problem is happening all over the world. As we live longer and as we get bigger, we get more obese, okay, there's a trend of increasing, as you can see, across the whole world. So this joint is going to become more and more important. In fact, the amount of replacements happening worldwide are always increasing, okay? So we're talking about very, very large amounts all over the world. And this is one of the points which Donald mentioned, which I think is worthwhile having a look at. So normally when we're standing up, the weight is distributed over both hips, over one and the other. And therefore it's relatively limited. You're carrying a very small amount. But if you can imagine, if you're walking on a single leg, you can actually have 400 to 500 times of body weight. So if you take about a 70 kilogram man, you're talking about almost 350 kilos of weight. And that would be even more possibly when you're stepping down, for example, onto a stair. Okay, so the amount of weight you're actually carrying on an individual hip joint is actually pretty massive. And this is the kind of reason why you need to do extensive testing. So the wear, as Donald said, actually we showed that we could do very, very, very well in actually showing the wear down. And this required a lot of collaboration and a lot of devices. So again, it's easy to see the nice terminal thing, which is over here. This is the classical ball and socket joint, whilst this over here is ours. And as you can see, it's made up of multiple joints. You can see there's different surfaces, metal, polymer, which is totally different from here where we have just one combination of metal and polymer. Okay, but to get there, you actually have a lot of iterations. So these were different iterations which were produced by Donald and even previous students, okay, who actually started developing from what we originally came up with, which looks very different from to what we have now, to the final product. And because of this final product, as Donald has said, apart from the very much reduced wear, we're talking about 300 to 400% reduced wear, okay, so 3 to 4 times as much. That's massive reduction. Apart from that, because of the fact that it is made of these different surfaces, we actually have the possibility of a huge range of motion. So the best hip joint presently on the market can flex and extend to around 140, 150 degrees. Ours actually can extend to well over 200 degrees. Okay, flexion and extension. So this would allow people to do the kinds of things which they couldn't do with a normal joint replacement. Like, for example, things which are very particular in certain cultures, like in the Far East. For example, squatting very far down, okay? Squatting almost while you're eating on the floor, squatting to the ground in a sense. This kind of thing would not be possible with most hip joint replacements, whilst in ours, it seems to be something which is possible. So we are looking again at these kind of niche markets, young people who need a long-term replacement, people in certain kinds of cultures who need a certain kind of movement, which would be accepted as standard normally in their case. And our novel design actually allows this. The other important thing to point out, which Donald has already mentioned, is it's actually made of the same materials which are already on the market. So there's no new toxicities. And as you asked, Jeremy, one of the things is now taking it to market. So when you have no new materials, there's no new toxicity, and therefore the route to market should theoretically be simpler and a bit faster.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope for the best for both of you. If this is clearly a very innovative and definitely helpful kind of medical device. Thank you so much for your input, guys. And we'll see you on the next panel.
Thank you very much. Thanks.